Kenya has launched two major funds, Sovereign Wealth Fund and the National Infrastructure Fund. But many Kenyans are wondering, what are these funds? And in fact, someone said these are just academic theories. But let me inform you, this is serious, and President Ruto is committed to ensuring that these two funds are anchored in law and they are implemented as soon as possible. But what are these funds? Sovereign Wealth Fund and National Infrastructure Fund. But before I explain these funds, I would like you to listen to President Ruto and Cabinet Secretary John Mbadi.
We are in the process of having two important funds, one infrastructure fund and the other, which we are going to roll out, Sovereign Wealth Fund. Kwa sababu hatuwezi kukula chakula yote ya leo, we must think about tomorrow. Neno la Mungu linasema, a good man leaves an inheritance for his children's children.
I will explain to Kenyans that for the first time, we are creating two funds in this country. One is what we call the Sovereign Wealth Fund for us and the future. And we are also creating what we are calling National Infrastructure Fund, where we are going to make sure that all the receipts and the proceeds of privatization will be put in that fund. We are not going to use it to finance salaries, recurrent expenditure. We will put it in an infrastructure fund and support only commercially viable infrastructure projects. I will take my time to explain to Kenyans we must think differently. If we continue thinking that there is money with IMF and World Bank to develop our country, there is no international finances anymore. Every country is in problems. The country of America is sorting out its own problems. That is the biggest economy. China is looking at themselves. All the countries, including Europe, because of Ukraine war, they are thinking of their survival. None of them will think about Kenya. It is upon us Kenyans to think on how to develop our country and use our resources, generate our own resources, sweat our assets to make sure that we develop our country. That is the idea. That is the idea that you need any person who sits at the treasury and the person who sits at State House or in the State House to make for the country to move forward. And we have made a decision to move this country forward. And you will see in the shortest time possible that Kenya will have its own infrastructure funds to develop itself.
I am certain after listening to President Ruto and John Mbadi, you have understanding of what these funds are. Not actually some complete understanding of what these funds are, but allow me to explain these funds. And here I begin with Sovereign Wealth Fund. Now this fund has three categories. There was a draft of Sovereign Wealth Fund 2019. So meaning that these are not alien discussions. People are talking about things that the government has been planning to implement. So President Ruto did not just create Sovereign Wealth Fund. It is something that has been in existence when it comes to monetary issues or economic issues in Kenya. It has been discussed before, and there was a draft. So what we have right now is a draft of Sovereign Wealth Fund 2025, which will be tabled on the floor of Parliament, and if passed, then Kenya will have, for the first time, Sovereign Wealth Fund. And as I mentioned, there are three categories. And the first category of this fund is called Stabilization Fund. And someone would wonder, what is this Stabilization Fund? Just from the word to stabilize. When you stabilize something, it means there's a crisis. There's something perhaps external that is hindering you from moving forward or that is preventing you from meeting your daily needs. This stabilization fund will work this way, that when Kenya faces a problem like drought, some of this money from holding account that is under Sovereign Wealth Fund will be put in the Kenyan economy. I am using very basic words here so that we are able to understand each other. Now look at it this way. During COVID-19, what happened to Kenya? Economically, many of us were affected. And to some level, the government was unable to meet its fiscal obligations. and the government was under pressure to provide essential services. So in a situation like that, what the government does is that it takes some of its money from the holding account. So the government will take some of that money and put it in the Kenyan economy so that you're able to meet your physical obligations or meet your needs as a country. Another component of this sovereign wealth fund is called National Infrastructure Investment Fund. The government can have flagship projects that it considers important for national security, that it considers important for national prosperity. So what does the government do? Instead of the government borrowing money, the government will again go to this holding account and take some of that money and invest in what? In infrastructure. So that component is just about infrastructure that the government would want perhaps to do an irrigation scheme. It can go to that account and take that money and invest it somewhere. Okay, from that explanation, what you understand here is that sovereign wealth fund, it is like national savings account. You know, take it this way. You are a family man, so you decide to put some money somewhere in a savings account. But you appropriate that out of the money I am saving, a certain percentage will respond to this need, a certain percentage will respond to that need. So in this case, what I am saying is that when it comes to stabilization fund, that means you take some of the money you've saved and put it in areas that you think have budgetary constraints. Now, for National Infrastructure Investment Fund, what happens is that you take some of that money and invest in a certain project. Now, the last component is Future Generation Fund. In other words, they call it Urithi, that we can save some money for future generations. So that component of Future Generation Fund is definitely about the country saving for the future. I am sure you're getting that. Now, someone would ask a simple question. Then, where will the government get this money from? Because it is a national savings account. And for you also as an individual, before you save, you will always ensure that you know the source of the money for saving. I believe you get me up there. So, this is what the government will do. The government, like Kenya here, has some natural resources. So when Kenya sells some of its natural resources, all the money received from those natural resources is not used in the national budget. Instead, the government decides to take some of that money into a savings account. You get what I mean? Until that point, that means Kenya can sell oil, gas, and rare minerals, and some of that money is taken into our savings account, which is definitely sovereign wealth fund. You get what I mean? Next, it can be state assets. As a country, we have assets. So what can happen is the government can decide to sell some of those assets, and some of the money received is not utilized in our daily operations. Instead, some of that money is put in that account, that is sovereign wealth fund. I am sure you are getting me up to that level. Additionally, the government has shares. So what the government can do, maybe after selling its shares, instead of using all that money in the national budget, it can save some of that money. Also, we have dividends, where the government has invested some money, the government gets dividends. Instead of putting all that money in the national budget, the government can save it. Additionally, we have privatization. Like right now, the government has been talking about denationalizing some of its assets. That means you transfer the assets to private sector or to private ownership. So when the government denationalizes an asset, some of the money received from that transaction is put in this fund. I am sure you're getting me up to that level. So those are some of the sources for this sovereign wealth fund. Now, let's move to National Infrastructure Fund. Basically, this I talked about it in my previous video, so I will share a link here. But maybe just to go through it a little bit. President Ruto has been talking about Kenyans asking for roads and all that. Now, when it comes to this fund, the sources are just basic, as I mentioned in the previous video. that you as a private investor, you can put your money in that fund. For National Infrastructure Fund, is basically about pooling resources for a project. Let me give you a basic example. We have Rironi Nakuru Mau Summit, right? Such an infrastructure, the government has been looking for money, and this money can come in through public-private partnerships. Okay? We can also have some foreign investors, people who put their money in this fund, so that when Kenya is undertaking a project, their money is directed there. So in all that, they expect some returns. That's why we have the issue of tolling of roads. The government wants to do some roads, and these roads will be tolled. So meaning those people who invested their money in such projects will get some returns. So to have a deeper understanding of National Infrastructure Fund, kindly watch that video. But here are emerging issues. One of the emerging issues regarding this fund is savings. People are asking, does Kenya have enough money to save? If at all, we don't have budget surplus. We have budget deficits. In fact, we borrow more for our national budget. So we don't have any surplus. Instead, we have deficits. So if we have deficits, why should we save for the future generations? So that is a legitimate conversation that Kenyans should have, because to some extent it doesn't make sense that you have to save for a future generation when right now some of your needs are unmet.
Countries that have surplus in foreign exchange, I mean in current account payments, we have a deficit.
If we take into account coal in the Mui Basin, yes, titanium ore down in Kwale, the minuscule oil reserves we have in northern Kenya, would we get to a level of scale necessary for a sovereign wealth fund?
No, let me introduce a third factor, and perhaps it looks unfair, but let me introduce a third factor. One, many of the countries that have very good sovereign wealth funds, and we're talking about Singapore for the purposes that it has good exports and therefore has a surplus in that respect. We're talking about Norway, and we are talking about Qatar and all these, and countries in the Gulf. Many of them are also countries that are already at a middle income level at the least. Now, why? So you're now saving money to actually ensure that the future, I mean, you preserve revenues for future investments and all that. Now, Kenya is not even at a middle income level. We are not even at the basic $1,000. So why would we save money for future generations when today's generations are starving?
Another thing that Kenyans are asking is, does Kenya have enough natural resources? Because as I mentioned, that the government depends on natural resources to some extent to have some money for sovereign wealth fund. Does Kenya have enough oil, gas, and rare minerals? To some extent. So Kenya will be exploiting some of its rare minerals, oil, and gas. And the money generated from that, some of it will be saved. But Kenyans are saying Kenya is not like Qatar, Norway, Venezuela, and these other countries that have many natural resources. But the Kenyan government says we have some of those resources. And given that this fund does not fully rely on natural resources, it is still okay for the country to move forward and have this fund. And remember this, Botswana has it. Botswana started this fund long ago. That was in 1990s. And it started because of its diamonds, that it exposed diamonds, and some of the money it received from diamonds, it was necessary for the government to save for future generations. And right now, Botswana has introduced another fund directed to sovereign wealth fund. It has just expanded it a little bit so that this fund can have different sources. Another issue that is troubling Kenyans when it comes to this fund is mismanagement. Remember this, Malaysia equally has such a fund, but political figures and insiders looted it. So Kenyans fear that we can still save money as sovereign wealth fund, but some people go ahead to steal it. That's the worry Kenyans have. Transparency and accountability has been so minimal in Kenya. So now we have this fund. How safe are we from these looters? That is something that Kenyans are worried about. But from your own judgment, do you think it is necessary for Kenya to implement sovereign wealth fund at a point when Kenya has such huge budget deficits? Let's discuss that. And always keep it here on Owen Analysis.